The train wailed, a lonesome cry swallowed by the immensity of the New Mexico desert. It was a beast of iron and steam, charging through a world of baked earth and scorched sky. Its smoke a fleeting gray smear against an endless canvas of ochre and pale blue. Inside the last car, the air was thick with heat, silence, and the fine red dust that seeped through every crack and settled on every surface like a shroud. Sunlight, bleached of all its warmth, cut through the grimy windows in solid, hazy bars, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in a lazy, hypnotic swirl. This was a silence born not of peace, but of shared endurance. Each passenger was an island, adrift in the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel, the only sound that dared to challenge the desert's oppressive quiet. A preacher in a sweat-stained collar stared blankly at his Bible, its pages as still as his faith in this godless expanse. A family of 4, huddled together on a wooden bench, looked as if they'd been sculpted from the very dust that covered their worn clothes. The parents' faces were grim masks of exhaustion, the children too weary to even whisper. A gambler, his brocade vest a gaudy splash of defiance, shuffled a deck of cards with hands that were slick with sweat. The soft snap of the cards a tiny, futile rebellion. They were all running from something or to something. It made no difference. In this purgatorial space, the past was a ghost, and the future was a mirage shimmering on the horizon. Here, there was only the journey. And at the very back of the car, in the corner where the shadows clung longest, sat Ridge Callahan. He was a man carved from the landscape itself. His face was all harsh angles and sun-weathered plains, a topography of a life lived under an unforgiving sun. A scar, a pale white line, cut a path from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a permanent reminder of a question asked and answered in violence. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes, when he bothered to open them more than a sliver, were the flat, hard gray of river stones. They held no warmth, no judgment, no curiosity. They simply were. He sat with a stillness that was unnerving, a coiled quiet that was more imposing than any boast. His broad shoulders filled out a dusty black duster that had seen more miles than the train itself. It hung open, revealing a simple homespun shirt and, on his hip, the well-worn walnut grip of a Colt revolver. The gun wasn't a threat. It was a part of him, as natural and necessary as a limb. He hadn't spoken a word since boarding in Santa Fe. He hadn't looked at anyone for more than a passing second. He was a locked door, and no one in the car had any intention of knocking. Men who looked like Ridge Callahan were best left to their own silence. Their stories were often written in blood, and to ask for a reading was to invite a chapter of your own. The heat pressed down. The wheels chanted their endless, metallic litany, "Get on, get on, get on." Ridge stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but he wasn't seeing the heat-deviled mesas or the skeletal arms of the saguaro cacti. He was seeing nothing, a practiced emptiness he had cultivated over years of long, lonely rides. He was a man who had learned that the only way to survive the vast, empty spaces outside was to nurture a vast, empty space within. Then, the world shattered. The door at the front of the car slammed open, crashing against the interior wall with a bang that made every passenger jolt. A collective gasp, a rustle of movement, and then a deeper, more anxious silence fell as everyone turned to stare. She stood framed in the doorway, a whirlwind of desperation against the placid backdrop of the desert. She couldn't have been more than 19, her youth a stark contrast to the ancient fear in her eyes. Her dress, once a respectable calico blue, was torn at the shoulder and hem, smeared with dirt and something darker near the cuff. Her hair, a cascade of rich chestnut, had escaped its pins and whipped around her face in wild strands, matted with sweat and dust. Her face was smudged, her lips were pale and chapped, and a scratch marked her cheek. But it was her eyes that held the carriage captive. They were wide, the color of a stormy sea, and they darted around the car, frantic and animalistic, like a doe cornered by wolves. She took a stumbling step inside, her breath coming in ragged, audible gasps. The conductor, a portly man with a walrus mustache, appeared behind her, his hand outstretched. "Now, miss, you can't be—" She paid him no mind. Her gaze swept over the passengers, over the preacher who clutched his Bible tighter, over the gambler whose hands had frozen mid-shuffle, over the mother who instinctively pulled her children closer. In their eyes, she saw what she expected: pity, fear, and the polite, unyielding refusal to get involved. Their faces were mirrors of the world she was fleeing, a world that saw trouble and turned away. Then her eyes landed on Ridge. He hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched at the sound of the door. He simply watched her, his expression as unchanging as the stone bluffs outside. He did not look away. He did not offer pity. He did not register shock. He just looked, his gaze a steady, unreadable weight. And in that stony stillness, she saw something different. Not a promise of safety, but an acknowledgement of danger. He looked like a man who wasn't afraid of wolves because he had lived among them. Her decision was made in that heartbeat of shared stillness. She lurched forward, stumbling down the aisle, her torn skirt whispering against the dusty floorboards. The other passengers shrank back from her as if her desperation were a contagion. She ignored them, her entire being focused on the man in the corner. She stopped before him, her small frame trembling so violently it seemed a strong gust of wind could shatter her. He could smell the fear on her, a sharp, metallic scent, mingled with dust and sweat. He watched the frantic rise and fall of her chest. Her voice, when it came, was not a plea but a raw, broken whisper that barely carried over the noise of the train. "Please," she breathed, her eyes locking with his. "Please, hide me." Ridge Callahan looked at the girl. He saw the torn dress, the wildness in her eyes, the sheer, primal terror that had stripped away everything but the will to survive. He saw the story she carried without her needing to speak a single word of it. It was an old story, one he'd seen written in countless variations across the unforgiving face of the West. It was a story of men who take and women who run. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what she had done or what had been done to her. He did not ask who was coming for her. The answers were irrelevant. Trouble had found its way to his door, as it always did. The only question that ever mattered was what you did when it knocked. Slowly, deliberately, without a word. Ridge shifted his weight. The movement was economical, fluid. He drew one side of his heavy duster forward, the thick, worn fabric parting like a curtain. He created a space beside him, a pocket of shadow between his body and the hard wall of the train. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was an offer of concealment, a dark, temporary grave in which to bury herself from the world. For a second, the girl hesitated, her eyes searching his for a trick, a price. She found nothing. His face was a mask of indifference. He was a rock offering a fissure, nothing more. Understanding dawned, followed by a wave of desperate gratitude that nearly buckled her knees. She scrambled into the space he had made, her movements clumsy with haste and fear. She tucked her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible, pressing herself against the vibrating wall of the train car. She was a bundle of trembling limbs and frayed nerves. Ridge let the duster fall back into place. The heavy wool fabric settled over her, and her world dissolved into a warm, stuffy darkness that smelled of dust, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. The deafening clatter of the train muted slightly. The harsh light of the desert was gone. There was only the solid wall of his side against her back, and the rhythmic, steady beat of his heart, a slow and heavy drum against the frantic tattoo of her own. He was so still, as she shivered uncontrollably, pressing her face into her knees to stifle the sound of her own ragged breathing. He remained a statue of granite. He hadn't even shifted his gaze from the window to the rest of the car, It would look as if he had merely adjusted his coat against a draft. The gambler cleared his throat and resumed his shuffling, a little faster this time. The preacher opened his Bible and stared at the words, his lips moving silently. The mother whispered something to her husband, who just shook his head and closed his eyes. The girl, Clara, had vanished. She was gone, swallowed by the shadow of a stranger, in the suffocating darkness beneath his coat. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 days, she felt a single, fragile thread of something that wasn't terror. It wasn't safety. Not yet. It was something far more fundamental. It was a moment of stillness in the heart of a storm, a breath drawn in the split second before the lightning strikes. Outside, the train wailed again, its cry echoing across the vast, indifferent land. A silent pact had been forged in the last car. A life had been entrusted on the strength of a whisper, and accepted with the simple, wordless gesture of opening a coat. From that moment, the solitary line of Ridge Callahan's journey was irrevocably tangled with another's. His carefully cultivated emptiness now held a secret, and as the train sped westward, carrying its cargo of weary souls, it carried two whose fates were now bound together, hurtling toward a future as unknown and unforgiving as the desert itself. Time ceased to exist in the suffocating darkness beneath the duster. For Clara, there was only the rhythmic jostle of the train and the steady, slow beat of the man's heart against her back. It was an anchor in a swirling sea of fear. Every sound from the carriage was magnified: a cough, the rustle of a page, the soft snap of the gambler's cards, each one a potential threat, a signal of discovery. She had burrowed into the small space he had given her, a shivering knot of desperation, praying for an invisibility she had never known. Outside her woolen cave, Ridge Callahan remained a sentinel of stone. His gaze was fixed on the shimmering horizon, but his senses were tuned to the carriage. He was a man accustomed to listening to the subtle shifts in the air, to the unspoken language of a room. He had felt the change before he heard it. It was a subtle drop in the atmospheric pressure, the kind of quiet that precedes a lightning strike. The train began to slow, its rhythmic clatter descending into a mournful groan of breaking steel. A stop in the middle of nowhere was never a good sign. It meant trouble had boarded, or was about to. Through the window, Ridge saw no town, no water tower, only a sun-blasted siding with a lone, rickety platform. As the train hissed to a halt, the door at the front of the car slid open again. This time, there was no crash, just a deliberate, heavy scrape of wood on iron. 3 men stepped inside, and the air in the car turned thick and cold, a stark contrast to the searing heat outside. They did not belong here. They were not weary travelers or hopeful homesteaders. They were hunters, and their prey was in this room. The man in the lead was tall and whip-thin. His face burned a permanent, angry red by the sun. A cruel, thin-lipped smile seemed etched onto his face, and his eyes, small and dark, scanned the car with a proprietary air. He wore a dusty bowler hat and a long coat, despite the heat that failed to conceal the bulge of a pistol holstered high on his hip. This was their leader. His 2 companions fanned out behind him. One was a hulking brute of a man with a vacant expression and ham-sized fists that hung at his sides as if they were itching for something to crush. The other was younger, wiry and restless, with a nervous energy that made him seem more dangerous than the big man's quiet menace. He had a mean, eager look in his eye. The leader, Silas, let the door slide shut behind him, plunging the car into a tense, dim silence broken only by the faint hiss of the engine. "Afternoon, folks," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl that held no warmth. "Just a routine inspection. Looking for a stray piece of property that belongs to my employer, Mr. Finch." He paused, letting his gaze drift over the passengers, savoring the fear that was blooming on their faces. A young woman, brown hair, blue eyes, pretty thing, answers to the name Clara. You might have seen her. No one moved. No one spoke. The preacher's face had gone ashen. The mother clutched her children, her knuckles white. Silas's smile widened. No, well, we'll just have a look for ourselves. Be a lot easier for everyone if you just sit still. Beneath the duster, Clara's breath caught in her throat. A whimper escaped her lips. A tiny, hopeless sound that was swallowed by the heavy fabric. She felt Ridge's body tense, a subtle hardening of the muscles along his back. It wasn't a movement of fear, but of readiness. The two men began to move down the aisle, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. They were methodical. The big man, Jeb, would loom over a passenger while the younger one, Finn, would poke and prod at their luggage, his movements sharp and invasive. Silas followed a few paces behind, his eyes missing nothing. They reached the gambler first. Finn snatched the cards from his hands. "What you got here, friend?" "Just a game of solitaire," the gambler stammered, his bravado gone. Finn sneered and scattered the cards across the floor. "Looks like you lose." They moved on. They questioned the family, their voices low and menacing, their presence alone a violation. The little girl began to cry, and the mother shushed her, her own eyes wide with terror. Clara could hear it all, the gruff questions, the terrified whispers, the sound of a bag being emptied onto a seat. Each footstep brought them closer, a drumbeat counting down her last seconds of freedom. She pressed herself tighter against Ridge, her nails digging into her own palms. The heat was unbearable, a physical manifestation of her terror. Ridge did not move a muscle. He continued to stare out the window, his posture relaxed, as if he were alone in the car. He seemed a part of the landscape, as unmovable as the mesas on the horizon. But his stillness was a lie. It was the calm of a panther watching from the brush, every fiber of his being humming with a deadly awareness. Finally, they stood before him. The shadows of the three men fell over his seat. "Well now," Silas drawled, his voice dangerously soft. "What if we hear a fellow who likes his privacy?" Ridge slowly, very slowly, turned his head from the window. He did not look at Silas's face. He lifted his gaze and met the man's eyes directly, and he held it. The air crackled. The gray of Ridge's eyes was not empty now. It was filled with something cold and ancient, a flinty hardness that promised nothing but brutal consequence. It was a look that said, "I have seen men like you before, and I have buried them." It was a look that spoke of long, bloody nights and the cold finality of the grave. It held no anger, no fear, only a profound and chilling certainty. Silas, for the first time, felt his thin smile falter. He had dealt with tough men, gunslingers, and lawmen, but this was different. This was not the bravado of a man trying to prove something. This was the absolute lack of it. This man wasn't trying to be dangerous. He simply was. Silas looked at the scar on Ridge's face, at the worn grip of his Colt, at the utter calm in his eyes, and a cold knot of professional caution tightened in his gut. This was not a fight worth picking over a runaway girl. He held the stare for a long moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had made his decision. "Just a tired cowboy," Silas said, his voice holding a note of finality for his men. "Leave him be. Let's check the next car." Jeb, the big man, grunted in agreement, already turning away. But Finn, the wiry one, hesitated. His eyes narrowed, darting from Ridge's impassive face to the bulky shape of his duster. It was too hot for a coat that heavy. Something was wrong. "Hold on, Silas," Finn whispered, taking a half-step forward. "That coat! He's hiding something." Silas shot him a warning look. "I said leave it." But it was the only trigger Ridge needed. The moment Finn took that step, the moment doubt entered the equation, the time for stillness was over. In a single explosive movement, Ridge was on his feet. He wasn't just fast, He was impossibly sudden, as if he had teleported from a sitting position to a standing one. One arm wrapped around Clara, pulling her out from under the coat and hauling her against his side. She gave a small cry of shock as the light and noise of the car crashed back in on her. "What the?" Finn started to say, his hand dropping to his gun. He never finished. Ridge was already moving, not towards them, but away. He spun, pulling Clara with him, and sprinted for the rear of the car. It was a desperate, mad dash of less than 15 feet. The other passengers cried out in alarm, scrambling out of his way. "Get them!" Silas roared, the spell of Ridge's gaze broken by the sudden violence of his action. The world became a blur of motion for Clara. She was being half dragged, half carried, her feet barely touching the floor. All she could see was the back of Ridge's shirt and the blur of shocked faces. She heard a gunshot, a deafening crack that echoed in the confined space, followed by the splintering of wood somewhere behind them. They reached the end of the car. It was a solid wall of iron and wood, save for a small, heavy door used for coupling and emergencies. There was no time. Ridge didn't hesitate. He slammed Clara against the wall next to the door, shielding her with his body. He gripped the heavy iron latch. It was rusted, stiff. He threw his entire weight against it, his muscles straining. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time. Clara felt a sharp sting as a splinter of wood flew past her cheek. She could hear the heavy thud of the men's boots as they charged down the aisle. With a final, desperate heave, the latch gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Ridge shoved the door open. A hurricane of noise and heat and sand blasted into the car. The world outside was a rushing, chaotic blur of brown and yellow. The roar of the wind was deafening. The train was picking up speed again, the wheels screaming against the tracks. Ridge grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. He looked down at her, his face a grim mask against the swirling sand. His stone-gray eyes met hers for a single, wild second. There was no reassurance in them, only a silent, stark command. "Trust me." And then he pulled her out of the train. For a moment, there was nothing. A vertiginous sense of weightlessness, of being suspended between the moving train and the static earth. The wind ripped the breath from her lungs. Below her, the ground was a terrifying, fast-moving tapestry of rock and sand. Then, gravity took hold. They hit the ground with a brutal, bone-jarring impact. It wasn't a clean landing. They tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs, down a steep, sandy embankment. Clara cried out as her shoulders slammed into the ground, and the world spun in a nauseating vortex of sky and earth. Sand and gravel scraped her skin raw, filling her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. They rolled, over and over, until finally coming to a rest at the bottom of the slope in a tangled heap. For a long moment, there was only pain and the ringing in her ears. Clara lay gasping, the air burning in her raw throat. Every inch of her body ached. Slowly, she pushed herself up on trembling elbows. The train was already 100 yards away, a shrinking black line against the horizon, its smoke trailing behind it like a fading ghost. The shouts of the men were lost to the wind. They were alone. She looked at Ridge. He was already on one knee, his revolver in his hand, scanning their surroundings. His face was bleeding from a cut on his cheek. His clothes were torn, but his eyes were sharp, alert, already assessing the new reality. And what a reality it was. They were in the heart of the furnace. The sun was a merciless white fire in the sky, beating down with a physical force. The sand beneath her was scorching hot, even through the fabric of her dress. The air was so dry it felt as if it were stealing the moisture from her body with every breath. In every direction, the desert stretched out, a vast, silent, and utterly alien world of heat and rock and endless empty space. The hunt under the blazing sun had ended. The escape had just begun. "Get up!" The voice was not a request. It was a low, rough-edged command, cutting through the ringing in Clara's ears. It was the first word he had spoken to her, and it held no comfort, only raw urgency. She opened her eyes, the world a painful, overexposed photograph. Ridge was already standing, a dark silhouette against the blinding sky. He offered no hand, he simply waited, his gaze not on her, but on the distant, shrinking train. Pain was a white-hot fire in her shoulder, and 1,000 smaller fires burned in the scrapes and cuts that covered her arms and legs. Her head throbbed in time with the merciless pulse of the sun. Every instinct screamed at her to lie still, to let the scorched earth claim her. But the image of Silas's cruel smile and Finn's eager eyes was a more potent fuel than any pain. She forced her trembling limbs to obey, pushing herself to her knees, then staggering to her feet. The world tilted violently, and she swayed, a ragged doll on the verge of collapse. This way, now. He was already moving, not running, but striding with a long, ground-eating pace that spoke of absolute purpose. He headed away from the tracks, toward a jagged spine of red rock that jutted from the desert floor like the bones of a dead leviathan. There was no path, only a treacherous sea of loose rock and thorny scrub. Clara stumbled after him, her torn dress snagging on every greedy branch. Her city shoes, thin and useless, offered no protection from the sharp stones that littered the ground. Each step was a fresh agony. The silence between them was absolute, broken only by her ragged gasps for air and the crunch of their feet on the gravelly soil. The desert was a vast, silent witness, its only movement the shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground. They reached the rock formation within minutes that felt like hours. Ridge didn't slow. He led her to a narrow fissure, a dark crack in the stone barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. It was a place of deep shadows and cool, still air. He slipped inside without a backward glance, disappearing into the darkness. For a terrifying second, Clara hesitated, the thought of being trapped in the dark with this stranger a new and chilling fear. But the open sun-bleached expanse behind her was infinitely more terrifying. She took a breath and followed him into the rock. The temperature dropped instantly. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp stone and ancient dust. It was a blessed relief from the furnace outside. The fissure was a tight, winding passage, the walls close enough to touch on either side. After about 20 feet, it opened into a small, hidden alcove, a natural chamber shielded from the sky above by an overhang of rock. Ridge had already dropped to one knee. From a small leather pouch on his belt, he produced a piece of flint and a small steel striker. He scraped a handful of dry, brittle moss from the rock wall and gathered a few dried twigs that had blown into the crevice. Clara watched, her breath still coming in painful rasps, as he worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted effort. A few sharp strikes of steel against flint, a shower of sparks, and a tiny, fragile flame licked at the moss. He gently fed it the twigs until a small, smokeless fire was burning. He wasn't building it for warmth. He looked at her, his gray eyes assessing her scraped hands and bleeding cheek. He said nothing, but his meaning was clear. He was tending to business first. He left the small fire and slipped back out of the alcove. Clara could hear him moving just outside the fissure, the sound of dry brush being broken and gathered. He returned a moment later with 2 large armfuls of tumbleweed and sun-baked grass. He carried the tinder to the mouth of the fissure, on the side facing away from the train tracks. He knelt, took a burning twig from his small fire, and touched it to the base of the pile. The effect was instantaneous. The desert dry vegetation erupted in a furious whoosh of flame, which almost immediately gave way to a thick, acrid cloud of gray-white smoke. The wind, which had been their enemy in the open, was now their ally. It caught the smoke and dragged it sideways, pulling it in a thick, billowing screen across the landscape, back towards the railroad tracks. It was a perfect curtain, a shifting wall of haze that would obscure their tracks and confuse anyone looking for them from a distance. A ghost to chase. He stamped out the small fire in the alcove, grinding the embers into the sandy floor with his heel until not a single spark remained. He then turned to Clara. From his belt, he unhooked a canteen. He uncapped it and held it out to her. She took it with trembling hands, the metal cool against her skin. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, the water a soothing balm on her raw throat. He watched her, his face impassive, until she had drunk her fill. He gestured for the canteen back, took a short, single swallow himself, and capped it. "We move," he said, not a question, a statement of fact. He pointed, not back the way they came, but deeper into the labyrinth of rock and shadow. He held up a hand, palm flat, "Stay low." Then he curled his fingers into a fist, "Stay quiet." And so their real journey began. Ridge set a relentless pace, a silent, fluid shadow pouring over the rocks. He never chose the easy path. He led them through tight squeezes, over treacherous ledges, and down steep, gravelly slopes where the only handholds were thorny bushes and sharp-edged rocks. He moved with the quiet confidence of an animal in its own territory, his boots making barely a sound. For Clara, it was a special kind of hell. Her body was a symphony of pain. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, and the thin soles of her shoes were soon in tatters. She slipped and fell, scraping her knees, her hands becoming a raw mess of cuts and scratches. More than once, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out, but she never stopped. She would see his dark form pause up ahead, a patient silhouette waiting in the shadows, and she would grit her teeth, push the pain down, and force herself to go on. He never offered a word of encouragement, but he also never left her behind. His patience was as silent and unyielding as his pace. He was teaching her, though she didn't realize it at first. With simple gestures, he showed her how to place her feet to avoid sending a cascade of loose stones tumbling down a slope. He pointed out the difference between a rock that would hold her weight and one that would shift. He tapped his ear and then pointed, indicating a sound he wanted her to listen for, the distant cry of a hawk, the skittering of a lizard, training her to be aware of the life and sound of the desert. They left the rocks behind in the late afternoon, emerging into a landscape of rolling, arid hills covered in mesquite and sagebrush. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the land. The heat was less a hammer and more a suffocating blanket. Ridge found a dry creek bed, an arroyo, its sandy bottom a pale scar winding through the hills. It offered a sunken path, keeping them below the sight line of the surrounding terrain. They walked in the soft sand of the arroyo for what felt like an eternity. The world shrank to the high, crumbling banks on either side and the endless path of sand before them. The only sound was the whisper of their own breathing and the soft scuff of their feet. Clara fell into a state of numb exhaustion. It was no longer about fear or pain. It was about the simple, mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. Follow the man, stay on your feet, keep moving. Once, she stumbled badly, her ankle twisting beneath her. She went down hard in the sand with a pained gasp. Before she could even process the fall, he was there. He knelt beside her, his movements swift and efficient. His calloused fingers gently but firmly probed her ankle. It was the first time he had touched her since pulling her from the train. His touch was impersonal, clinical, but in her exhausted state, it felt like an anchor. He seemed satisfied that it wasn't broken. And then, without a word, he tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of his own shirt. He bound her ankle tightly, the rough fabric providing a surprising amount of support. Then he stood, looked at her, and simply nodded. The gesture was clear. The world doesn't stop for your pain. Get up. And she did. As the sun finally bled into the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the landscape began to change. The air grew cooler. The harsh, thorny scrub began to give way to patches of hardy grass and the occasional stunted juniper tree. The hills grew closer together, their slopes gentler. Ridge stopped at the crest of a low rise. He held up a hand, signaling for her to halt and stay down. He crept forward to the edge and lay flat. Peering over, he stayed there for a long time, a motionless observer scanning the scene below. Clara waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Had they reached a destination or another danger? Finally, he motioned for her to join him. She crawled the last few feet on her hands and knees, her body screaming in protest, and peered over the rise. Below them lay a small, secluded valley, cupped in the palm of the surrounding hills. It was a secret, hidden world, a thread of a stream, lined with a handful of cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled in the evening breeze. Cut through the valley floor, and nestled near the stream, tucked against the slope of a hill, was a house. It wasn't much of a house. It was a low, rambling structure built of dark, weathered wood and sun-baked adobe bricks, looking as if it had grown out of the earth itself. A simple porch ran along the front, and a stone chimney stood sentinel at one end. A sturdy-looking corral stood nearby, empty save for a water trough. It was a place of profound stillness and isolation. It was a fortress of solitude. This was it. This was where he had been leading her. His ranch. Ridge watched the valley for another full minute, his eyes tracking the long shadows, listening to the evening sounds. Satisfied, he pushed himself up and started down the gentle slope. Clara followed, her exhaustion so complete that she was practically sleepwalking. The supportive wrap on her ankle was the only thing keeping her upright. As they drew closer, she could see the details. The wood of the porch was worn smooth by years of sun and wind. The windows were small, dark squares. There was no sign of life, no light, no sound save for the whisper of the wind and the gentle murmur of the stream. They reached the porch. The steps groaned under Ridge's weight. He crossed to the heavy wooden door and pushed it open without knocking. It swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing a room steeped in shadow. He stepped inside and turned, looking at her, waiting. Clara stood on the threshold, swaying on her feet. She looked from the dark, unknown interior of the house to the vast, empty wilderness at her back. She had followed this silent, dangerous man across a landscape of hell, trusting in nothing but his ability to survive. Now, she had reached his sanctuary. She took one step across the threshold, then another. The last of her strength deserted her. Her vision swam. The shadows in the room rushed up to meet her, and the world dissolved into blackness as she collapsed onto the hard, wooden floor. She woke to stillness. It was the quality of the silence that registered first, not the tense, watchful silence of the train car, nor the vast, roaring silence of the desert. This was a deep, quiet peace, thick and soft as the wool blanket that covered her. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. Clara opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the muted light filtering through a small, clean window. She wasn't on a hard wooden floor. She was lying on a narrow cot, tucked into the corner of a small room. The mattress beneath her was stuffed with straw, but it felt like a feather bed. The walls were made of rough-hewn timber, the gaps chinked with dried mud. A simple, three-legged stool stood beside the cot, and on it sat a tin basin of water and a folded piece of clean, homespun cloth. She sat up, a groan escaping her lips as a chorus of aches and pains made themselves known. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, bruised agony, but the searing pain was gone. She looked down at herself. Her torn, filthy dress was gone. In its place, she wore a simple, oversized man's shirt of soft, worn flannel. It fell to her knees, clean and smelling faintly of soap. Someone had tended to her. Gingerly, she examined her arms and legs. The countless scrapes and cuts had been carefully cleaned. The wrap on her ankle was gone, replaced by a cleaner, neater binding. A wave of confusion, mixed with a profound and unsettling gratitude, washed over her. The silent, hard-faced man who had dragged her from a moving train and across a barren wasteland had also cleaned her wounds. The two images refused to reconcile in her mind. Pushing the blanket aside, she swung her legs over the side of the cot. The floorboards were cool and solid beneath her bare feet. For a long moment, she just sat there, listening. She could hear the gentle crackle and pop of a fire somewhere in the house, and the low, mournful sigh of the wind outside. Nothing else, no voices, no footsteps. Driven by a thirst that felt days old, she reached for the basin and drank deeply from her cupped hands. The water was cool and sweet. She used the cloth to wash the grime from her face and neck. The simple act feeling like a baptism. She felt a fraction more human. Her dress lay folded on the floor at the foot of the cot. It was clean, but the rips and tears remained, a testament to her flight. Next to it was a pair of men's trousers, cut off at the knee, and a pair of thick wool socks, practicality over propriety. She pulled them on. They were ridiculously large, but the trousers could be cinched with a piece of twine she found on the stool, and the socks were a blessing to her battered feet. Finally, she could delay no longer. She had to know what and who lay beyond the simple wooden door of her room. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she pushed it open. She stepped into the main room of the house. It was a single, large space that served as kitchen, dining room, and living area. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire murmuring within it, its flames casting a warm, dancing light on the dark wood and adobe walls. The furniture was sparse and handmade, built for function, not beauty. A long, sturdy table with two benches stood in the center of the room. A collection of cast-iron pots and pans hung from hooks near the hearth. Everything was scrupulously clean and orderly, reflecting a life of discipline and solitude. It was undeniably a man's home, but there was a sense of peace to it, a quiet integrity that soothed the raw edges of her fear. Ridge was nowhere to be seen. The room was empty. No, not empty. She saw him then. Sitting on the floor by the hearth, his back to her, was a small boy. He was utterly absorbed in his task, which seemed to be carving a piece of soft wood with a small, dull knife. He was a slip of a thing, with a mop of unruly, sandy brown hair. He wore a patched shirt and trousers, his bare feet tucked beneath him. He hummed a tuneless, happy little song to himself as he worked, the sound a startling note of levity in the silent house. Clara froze, her hand still on the door. A child. Here the possibility had never even crossed her mind. She stood rooted to the spot, a ghost in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or retreat. The boy must have sensed her presence. He stopped his humming and slowly turned his head. He had a serious little face, dusted with a faint smattering of freckles across his nose. But his eyes were wide and startlingly bright, filled with an open, guileless curiosity. He looked at her strange clothes and tangled hair. His head tilted like a curious bird. He wasn't afraid. "You're awake," he stated, his voice clear and high. It wasn't a question. Before Clara could find her own voice, the main door to the house opened, letting in a shaft of late afternoon sunlight. Ridge stepped inside, carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw her standing there, his gray eyes taking in her appearance with a single, sweeping glance. He looked from her to the boy and back again. He dropped the firewood into a wooden box by the hearth with a clatter. "Tom," he said, his voice the same low rumble she remembered. "This is Clara. She'll be staying a while." It was the most perfunctory of introductions. The boy, Tom, scrambled to his feet. He wiped his hands on his trousers and gave Clara a small, solemn nod. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," he said, with a politeness that was at odds with his scruffy appearance. "And you, Tom?" Clara managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. Ridge ignored the exchange. He moved to the hearth, stoked the fire, and hung a heavy iron pot over the flames from a swinging hook. He began to chop vegetables, onions, carrots, potatoes on a thick wooden board, his movements as efficient and precise as when he'd built the signal fire. He moved around the small kitchen space with a familiar grace, a man completely at home in his domain. The spell of silence was broken. Tom, his curiosity apparently satisfied for the moment, went back to his carving. Clara stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder, a misplaced piece in a puzzle she didn't understand. She should be grateful. She was safe, she was clean, she had been cared for. But trust was a currency she had long since run out of. This quiet man had saved her. But he was still a stranger, his past a locked book, his motives a mystery. And now, a child. An orphan, she presumed. What kind of life was this? She couldn't just stand there. An instinct, born of a lifetime of trying to be useful, to earn her place, took over. She walked softly to the hearth. Can I help?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Ridge didn't look up from his chopping. He simply jerked his chin toward a bucket of water and a stack of tin plates. The message was clear. She set to work, washing the plates, her hands clumsy at first. The simple, mindless task was calming. It gave her something to do, a reason to be there. They worked in silence. The only sounds the rhythmic chop of his knife, the slosh of her water, and the soft scraping of Tom's carving. When the stew was simmering, filling the small house with a rich, savory aroma, Ridge gestured for her to sit at the table. He ladled the thick stew into 3 bowls, and Tom placed a rough-hewn spoon beside each. They ate in the same profound silence. Clara watched them. She watched the way Tom would glance at Ridge from time to time, a silent question in his eyes, and how Ridge would give a barely perceptible nod or shake of the head in reply. They had a language that required no words. She saw the way Ridge made sure the boy had the piece of bread with the softest crust. Small things, unspoken things, acts of quiet care that were as much a part of the house as the timber walls. This was their life, a silent, self-contained world of 2, and now she was in it. The days that followed fell into a gentle, quiet rhythm. Her body healed. The deep bruises faded. The cuts scabbed over, and the strength slowly returned to her limbs. Her fear, however, did not vanish. It simply retreated, receding from a roaring fire to a bed of nervous embers. She would start at every unexpected sound, the cry of a hawk, the sudden slam of a door in the wind. She never strayed far from the house. The memory of the hunt was too fresh, the image of Silas's face a permanent fixture in her nightmares. Ridge never asked her a single question about her past. He seemed to have no curiosity about the life she had fled or the men who pursued her. He accepted her presence as he accepted the sunrise and the wind as a simple fact of his current reality. He would leave early each morning to work on his small ranch mending fences, tending to the 2 horses he kept in the corral, checking his traps. He would return at dusk, tired and covered in dust, and they would share their silent meal. To combat the gnawing anxiety and the sheer weight of her own thoughts, Clara threw herself into the work of the house. She learned the quirks of the cast-iron stove, how to bake dense but nourishing cornbread. She mended Tom's perpetually torn trousers with inexpert but sturdy stitches. She swept the floors, hauled water from the stream, and scrubbed their clothes on a washboard until her knuckles were raw. She was earning her keep. She was building a fragile wall of usefulness around herself, a defense against the day he might decide she was a burden and tell her to leave. And then there was Tom. He was the light in that quiet place. He was a whirlwind of 6-year-old energy, a creature of boundless curiosity. He followed Clara around as she worked, peppering her with 1,000 questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do the stars go in the daytime? Can a lizard be a horse if you're small enough? His questions were a balm, pulling her out of the dark maze of her own fears and forcing her into the bright, simple world of a child. He showed her his secret treasures, a smooth river stone that looked like a bird's egg, a hawk's feather, his collection of oddly shaped twigs. He was the one who coaxed her out of the house and into the sunlight, leading her down to the stream to watch the water skippers dance on the surface. One afternoon, while Ridge was out, Tom decided he wanted to help her make dinner. His help consisted mainly of spilling a bag of flour on the floor. And himself, he stood there, covered head to toe in white powder, looking so utterly dismayed and comical that something inside Clara cracked. A sound bubbled up from her chest, foreign and rusty. It was a laugh, not a giggle, but a real, full-throated laugh of pure amusement. It felt strange in her own throat, a muscle she hadn't used in a lifetime. Tom's look of dismay vanished, replaced by a wide, delighted grin. Seeing her laugh, he started to laugh too, a high, infectious peal of joy. He scooped up a handful of flour and playfully tossed it in her direction, dusting her arm. She laughed harder, scooping up a tiny bit herself and puffing it at his already white hair. For a few glorious moments, the quiet, somber house was filled with the sound of their laughter. The front door opened. Ridge stood on the threshold, his face streaked with dust, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene of chaos and mirth. Clara's laughter died instantly. A cold dread washed over her. She had been too loud. She had forgotten herself. She had disturbed the peace of his home. She braced herself for the anger, for the cold dismissal. Ridge looked at the flour-dusted kitchen, at the grinning, white-caked boy, and at Clara, her face frozen in a look of apprehension. He looked at her for a long moment, and the faintest, almost imperceptible twitch tugged at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, for just a fraction of a second, lost their stony hardness and seemed to soften. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head slowly, stepped inside, and closed the door on the world outside, leaving the three of them in the warm, flour-dusted air of the silent ranch. The laughter was gone, but the echo of it remained, a fragile promise of peace in a world that had offered her none. The laughter from that flour-dusted afternoon left a ghost in the quiet ranch house. It was a fragile warmth, a flicker of light in the deep shadows of Clara's fear. For a few days, the embers of her anxiety seemed to cool. She fell into the rhythm of the ranch, her hands busy, her mind blessedly quiet. The small, secluded valley began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a sanctuary. But peace, she had learned, was a fleeting and treacherous thing. The past was not a ghost that could be outrun. It was a hunter, and it always found you in the dark. It came for her in a dream. She was back in the opulent, suffocating parlor of Mr. Finch's house in Silver Creek, the air thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and cheap perfume. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, shutting out the sun. He was there, his face a pale mask of possession, his smile a bloodless slash that never reached his cold, flat eyes. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even touching her. He was just looking at her, that look of ownership that stripped her of her own skin, that made her feel like another one of his acquisitions, a prize mare, a gilded clock, a thing to be polished and displayed and used. The dream silence was heavier than any shout, and in it, she was suffocating, her lungs screaming for air she couldn't find. She woke with a choked gasp, sitting bolt upright on the narrow cot, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Cold sweat slicked her skin, and the phantom smell of cigars was so strong it made her gag. The oversized shirt clung to her, damp and cold. The quiet of the small room was suddenly just as suffocating as the silence in her dream. She couldn't stay there. She couldn't breathe. Throwing off the blanket, she slipped out of the room, her bare feet silent on the cool wooden floor. The main room was dark, save for the soft orange glow of the dying embers in the hearth. A single moonbeam cut through a window, painting a silver stripe across the floor. She expected the room to be empty, that she would be alone with her terror. But he was there. Ridge sat at the long table, the moonlight catching the lines of his shoulders. He was working by the faint light of the fire, meticulously cleaning his revolver. The parts were laid out on a piece of oiled cloth in front of him, the cylinder, the barrel, the frame, his hands, which she had only known to be strong and capable, moved with a surgeon's delicacy and precision. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't seem to notice her. She stood in the shadows, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the mildness of the night. She should have gone back to her room. She should have left him to his quiet ritual. But she was anchored to the spot by a need she didn't understand, a desperate yearning for the simple, solid presence of another human being to stand against the formless terror of her memories. He must have felt her gaze. Without looking up from his work, he spoke, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be a part of the house's deep silence. The dreams are the worst part. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of shared experience. He knew, of course he knew. A man with eyes like his, with a scar like his, had his own legion of ghosts that hunted him in the dark. The unexpected empathy in his voice, as rough and unpolished as it was, broke something in her. The words began to spill out, not in a rush, but in a slow, halting trickle, like blood from a wound that would not clot. "My mother, she loved flowers," Clara whispered to the shadows, her voice thin and reedy. "Our home back in Ohio. It was small, but she had a garden, hollyhocks and daisies. She used to say that you could always find a little bit of God in a garden." Ridge continued his work, wiping a cloth down the barrel of the gun, the soft rasp of the fabric the only sound besides her trembling voice. "She died of a fever when I was 16. After that, things got hard. My father, he was not a strong man. He liked cards more than he liked working the farm. He was always chasing a debt, always looking for the easy way out." She took a ragged breath. The hardest part was coming. One day, a man came. His name was Abel Finch. He owned a saloon in a mining town out west. My father owed him a great deal of money, more than the farm was worth. She could see Finch now, as clearly as if he were standing in the room. His expensive, tailored suit that couldn't hide the coarseness of his character. The diamond stick pin in his cravat that winked like a chip of ice. The way his eyes had roamed over her. A cattleman assessing new stock. "They made a deal," she said, her voice dropping lower. "My father's debts would be cleared, in exchange for me." The words hung in the air, ugly and stark. She had never said them aloud before. It was a transaction, a piece of property changing hands to settle a ledger. Ridge paused in his work. He took the cylinder and slowly, methodically, began to load it, pushing each brass cartridge into its chamber with a soft, final click, 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 6 notes in a somber melody. "He called it a marriage," Clara continued, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her. "There was a fast-talking judge in his pocket. It was all very legal. Mr. Finch liked for things to be legal. He said it was cleaner that way. He took me to Silver Creek. The house was large, full of expensive things. He liked to show me off, my pretty, young bride from the East." Her voice began to break, the memories coming in sharp, painful fragments. "But when the doors were closed, I wasn't his bride. I was his investment. Something he had paid for. He had a heavy hand when he drank. And he was always drinking. He had a temper. And he didn't like to be disobeyed. The house was a cage. I just had to sit in it and look pretty and be quiet." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. The shame and humiliation of physical weight. She remembered the silence of that house, the terror of hearing his key in the lock, the constant effort of being invisible, of making herself smaller and smaller until she hoped she might disappear entirely. Ridge finished loading the revolver. He snapped the cylinder shut and laid the complete, deadly weapon on the cloth. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to walk away, that her story was too much, a burden he had no wish to carry. But he didn't leave. He walked to the dry sink by the hearth, where the tin plates and cups from dinner were stacked. He picked up the kettle from the hearth, poured warm water into the basin, and he began to wash the dishes. The simple, domestic sound of water splashing, of a cloth scrubbing a plate, was so profoundly at odds with the ugliness of her story that it stunned her into silence. He stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders blocking the faint firelight. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't judging her. He was just there, washing the dishes. His quiet, unyielding presence gave her the strength to finish. "One night," she whispered, "he had friends over, other men like him. He had been drinking all evening. He tried to make me entertain them. He said a man had a right to show off what was his." The memory was a blur of leering faces, of rough laughter, of her own paralyzing fear. "I refused. I locked myself in my room. The things he shouted through the door. After his friends left, he broke it down. He was angrier than I had ever seen him. That was the night I knew. I knew if I stayed, I would die in that house. Maybe not the next day, but soon, one piece at a time, I would just fade away. So I ran. I waited until he was passed out. I took what little money I had and a spare dress, and I climbed out a window. I just ran. I bought a ticket for the first train heading west. As far as my money would take me, I thought I could lose myself in the wilderness. But he sent men. Silas. The men on the train. He doesn't like his property to go missing." She finished, and the story was told. It lay in the quiet room between them, a poisoned, wretched thing. She stood shivering in the dark, stripped bare, her ugliest secrets exposed. She waited for his judgment, for his disgust, for him to tell her that her kind of trouble was not welcome in his home. Ridge finished the last plate. He rinsed it, placed it on the drying rack, and emptied the basin outside. He came back in, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stood by the hearth, looking not at her, but into the dying embers of the fire. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and in that silence, with his back still to her, in the safety of his quiet refusal to judge, Clara finally broke. A sob tore itself from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of a creature that had been holding its breath for an eternity. The tears came, a hot, cleansing flood. She wept for her lost mother, for her weak father, for the girl who loved flowers in a garden in Ohio. She wept for the shame and the fear and the loneliness. She sank to her knees on the cold floor and wept until her body ached with the force of it, until there were no tears left to cry. Through it all, Ridge did not move. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply stood his ground, a silent guardian, a solid, unmovable presence in the room. He let her grief wash over them, letting it run its course without interruption. He gave her the dignity of her sorrow. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering, exhausted breaths, he moved. He poured a cup of water from the bucket and placed it on the floor beside her. Then he went back to the table, picked up the oiled cloth, and carefully wrapped his clean, reassembled revolver in it. He took it and disappeared into the shadows at the other end of the room, where his own bed was. Clara knelt on the floor, her hands wrapped around the cool tin cup. The house was silent again. But the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. Her story was a part of it now. He had taken it, taken all the ugliness of it, and he had not turned her away. She looked around the simple, quiet room, at the warm hearth, at the sturdy table, at the place where the silent man had stood his ground for her. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. The men were still out there, but for the first time since she had climbed out that window in Silver Creek, a new, fragile thought began to take root in her heart. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the one place in the world where she could finally stop running. The night of her confession did not change the silence. but it altered its texture. Before, the quiet between them had been a space of caution and mystery. Now, it was a vessel, holding the fragile, broken pieces of her past. She had poured out her story into the darkness of the small house, and the silence had not shattered. It had held. She woke the next morning feeling raw and hollowed out, but strangely lighter. She expected to feel a profound shame, an unbearable vulnerability under Ridge's gaze. She expected to see a shift in his eyes, pity, perhaps, or a new, weary hardness that said her trouble was too heavy a burden. But when she emerged from her small room, he was at the hearth, exactly as he was every morning, tending the fire. He glanced at her as she entered, gave the same brief, single nod of acknowledgement he always did, and then turned back to his work. Nothing had changed. His consistency was a quiet, profound act of grace. He had taken her story, folded it away, and placed it somewhere inside his own vast silence. He would not speak of it. He would not treat her like a broken thing. This wordless acceptance was more comforting than any platitude or promise could ever be. It was a foundation, the first solid ground she had stood upon in years. And upon that ground, a new, unfamiliar feeling began to grow, gratitude so immense it was a physical ache in her chest. She wanted to thank him, but words felt clumsy and inadequate. How could thank you possibly contain the weight of what he had done? He had not just hidden her from her hunters. He had stood guard over her soul while it wept. The need to express this feeling became a quiet obsession as she went about her chores. She kneaded dough for the morning's bread with more vigor than necessary. She scrubbed the wooden table until the grain shone. But these were just actions, tasks. They were not a message. That afternoon, Tom, in his usual role as her small, shadow-like companion, led her on an expedition. His stated goal was to find the perfect forked stick for a slingshot. He tugged her by the hand, leading her away from the familiar path to the stream and up a gentle, sun-drenched slope she hadn't explored before. It was a part of the valley where the soil was richer, clinging to the base of the protective hills. And it was there she saw them. Clinging to the rocky earth, defying the harsh sun, was a patch of wildflowers. They were Indian paintbrushes, their brilliant, fiery red bracts like strokes of wet paint against the dusty green of their leaves and the muted brown of the earth. They were a sudden, breathtaking slash of color in a world of subtle shades. They were fierce and beautiful, a testament to life's stubborn insistence on finding a way to bloom, even in the most unforgiving of places. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. You can always find a little bit of God in a garden. This was not a garden. It was a wild, untamed patch of resilience. It was perfect. While Tom was busy examining the merits of various sticks, Clara knelt and gently plucked a single, perfect stalk. The flower felt vibrant and alive in her hand. It was a small, fragile thing, yet it held all the unspoken gratitude in her heart. She carried it back to the house, cupping it carefully in her palm. The question was what to do with it. To hand it to him directly felt too bold, too forward. It would demand a response. And their relationship was not built on demands. It was built on the space between words. That evening, after their silent meal, after Tom had been put to bed in his small loft, and after Ridge had taken to his chair by the fire to mend a piece of tack, she found her moment. She was on her way to her own room, her heart a nervous flutter in her chest. She paused at the front door, which stood slightly ajar to let in the cool night air. She looked at the worn, wooden step of the porch, a threshold between the sanctuary of the house and the dangers of the world. With a trembling hand, she placed the single, bright flower on the step, right in the center, where he could not miss it when he left in the morning. Then, her courage failing her, she scurried into her room and closed the door, her cheeks burning as if she had just confessed a secret love. She lay on her cot for hours, listening, wondering if he would find it, and what he would think. She imagined him seeing it and kicking it aside, a piece of useless sentimentality. The thought made her stomach clench. The next morning, she rose with a sense of dread. She was almost afraid to look. When she stepped out of her room, Ridge was already gone. She crept to the front door and peered out. The step was bare. The flower was gone. A wave of disappointment, sharp and cold, washed over her. He had thrown it away. It had been a foolish, childish gesture. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment and turned away from the door, her brief moment of hope dissolving into the familiar ache of rejection. Later that day, her disappointment had settled into a quiet melancholy. Ridge was sitting on the porch, working on the same piece of harness from the night before. Tom was playing nearby, trying to teach a lizard to stay still by whispering sternly to it. Clara was sweeping the porch, keeping her eyes down, not wanting to meet Ridge's gaze. He shifted in his chair to reach for a tool, and a small, leather-bound notebook that had been tucked between his leg and the arm of the chair slipped and fell to the porch with a soft thud. It fell open as it landed.
"I'll get it,"
Clara said quickly, grateful for the distraction. She knelt to pick it up, and she saw it. There, pressed between 2 pages filled with his neat, blocky script notes about fence lines, sketches of horse brands, lists of supplies, was her flower. It was perfectly preserved, its fiery color captured on the page, a brilliant splash of life amidst the stark, practical text. He had saved it. He had taken her small, silent offering and placed it within the private, ordered world of his thoughts. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at it for a long moment, the world seeming to slow and quiet around her. He hadn't thrown it away. He had understood. "Clara." Ridge's voice, low and questioning, broke the spell. She looked up and saw him watching her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were on her face, not on the book. She quickly snapped the notebook shut, her hands trembling slightly. "Here," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as she handed it back to him. He took it without a word and tucked it back into his duster pocket. The moment was over. But something had passed between them in that shared glance. In the space of that open book, it was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. Her silent message had been received, and a silent reply had been given. A few days later, a new conversation began. There was a large, flat-topped boulder down by the stream, shaded by a gnarled cottonwood tree. It had become Clara's spot. When the walls of the house felt too close, or her thoughts grew too loud, she would go there. She would sit on the sun-warmed stone, watch the light dapple through the leaves, and listen to the murmur of the water. It was a place of peace, a place where she could breathe. The rock was hard, and after a while, the unforgiving surface would make her shift and fidget. It was a small discomfort, one she had accepted as a matter of course. One afternoon, she went to her spot, her mind preoccupied with mending one of Tom's shirts. She reached the boulder, looked up, and stopped dead. Something was different. On top of the flat rock, right where she always sat, was a small, square piece of worn, oiled leather. It was a scrap, likely cut from an old saddle or a piece of harness. But its edges were neatly trimmed. It was a cushion, a simple, practical solution to a small, unspoken discomfort. Next to it sat a tin cup, beaded with condensation. She picked it up. It was filled with water, not from the stream, but from the deep well near the house. It was shockingly cold, a blessing in the afternoon heat. She stood there, holding the cool cup, and looked around. The valley was empty. Ridge was nowhere in sight. There was no note, no sign. There was only the evidence of his quiet observation. He had noticed her habit. He had seen her discomfort. And he had, in his own silent way, provided a remedy. This gesture struck her more deeply than the flower in the book. The flower had been her message to him. This was his message to her. It wasn't a response. It was an initiation. It wasn't about gratitude for a life saved. It was about care for a life being lived. It said, "I see you. I see your small routines, your small comforts. This place can be more than a refuge. It can be a home." She sat on the leather pad. It was soft and supple, still holding a faint warmth from the sun. She drank the cold water slowly, letting it soothe her. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow or fear. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming, and terrifying hope. This was their language, a dictionary of small kindnesses, the grammar of silence. He would leave a bucket of fresh water just inside the door when he saw she was tired. She would leave a slice of cornbread wrapped in a cloth on the porch rail for him when he was working late. He sharpened the kitchen knife she struggled with, leaving it gleaming on the cutting board. She mended a tear in his duster, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to his own rough repairs. None of it was ever mentioned. They were unnamed gestures, floating in the quiet space between them, building a bridge. With each small, unspoken act, Clara felt the foundations of that bridge solidifying. The world outside the valley was still filled with men like Silas and Finch. The danger was real. But inside this small, secluded world, a different kind of reality was being built. It was a reality built not on words or promises, but on the quiet, steady evidence of a wildflower pressed in a book, and a cup of cold water left on a stone. The weeks bled one into the next, and the fierce, white heat of summer began to soften, its edges fraying into the gentler gold of early autumn. The sun's dominion was shortened each day. The evenings arrived sooner, and the nights carried a crisp, clean chill that hinted at the coming cold. The valley, which had been a uniform canvas of dusty brown and pale green, began to show strokes of yellow in the cottonwood leaves along the stream. Time, which had once been a terrifying, relentless pursuer, had become a quiet, steady companion. Clara felt the change not just in the air, but in her own bones. The constant, thrumming anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life for so long had faded to a low hum. Her nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges blurred by the solid reality of her waking hours. She no longer jumped at every shadow. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. Her small room was her own. The main room, with its scent of wood smoke and coffee, was a place of quiet companionship. Her body, once a roadmap of bruises and scrapes, had healed. She moved with a new confidence, her limbs strong from hauling water and kneading bread, her skin tanned by the sun. The ranch had claimed her, and she had, in her own way, claimed it back. She knew the loose step on the porch, the spot by the stream where the water ran coldest, the particular way the wind whispered through the juniper trees on the high slopes. Her relationship with Tom had blossomed into a source of uncomplicated joy. He was her constant shadow, his bright, incessant questions a welcome antidote to the silence of the adults. She taught him his letters, scratching them in the dirt with a stick. He taught her the names of the desert plants and how to tell a hawk from a vulture by the shape of its wings. His easy laughter was the most beautiful sound in the world, and she found herself joining in, the sound still surprising in her own ears. But as one fear receded, another, more complex emotion began to take its place. It was a deep and unsettling curiosity, and its object was Ridge Callahan. She had built a life in the quiet spaces he provided, but the man himself remained an enigma. She had shown him the entirety of her wounded past, but his remained a locked and bolted door. She saw the evidence of his life every day, but it only raised more questions. She saw the gentleness in his hands when he showed Tom how to properly hold a knife for carving, his movements slow and patient. She saw the care in his eyes when he watched her from a distance, making sure she didn't lift a log that was too heavy. And then she saw the other man. She saw him in the startling, economic speed of his movements when a horse shied or a tool fell. She saw him in the way his eyes constantly scanned the high ridges that formed the walls of their valley, a silent, ceaseless patrol. She saw him in the way his hand always rested near the worn grip of his Colt, a gesture as natural and unconscious as breathing. He was two men, seamlessly inhabiting one body, the quiet rancher who provided a sanctuary, and the dangerous stranger who had pulled her from a moving train. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this peace they lived in was a fragile thing, purchased and protected by the second man. The gentle rancher could offer her a home, but only the dangerous stranger could keep the wolves from the door. And the wolves, she knew, were still out there. She needed to understand. She needed to know the nature of the man she was beginning to trust, not just with her life, but with the fragile, budding flower of her hope. The question formed in her mind over many days, a small, persistent seed. It waited for the right moment to be spoken, a moment of quiet and stillness, away from the innocent ears of the boy. The moment came on an evening when the sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to prick the twilight. Tom was asleep in his loft, tired out from a day of chasing grasshoppers. Clara had finished cleaning up after their meal and had stepped out onto the porch to breathe the cool night air. Ridge was at the corral, working by the light of a single lantern he had hung on a post. One of the horses had been favoring a foreleg, and he was checking the hoof. From the porch, Clara watched him. His movements were calm and sure, his voice a low, soothing murmur as he spoke to the animal. There was a profound stillness about him in these moments, a sense of a man completely at one with his task. When he was finished with the horse, he moved to a sawhorse where a bridle was draped. The leather rein had been frayed, and he had spent the last 2 evenings meticulously stitching it with a needle and waxed thread. He was finishing the job now, his large hands working with an intricate, focused grace. She felt herself drawn toward him, her feet moving without a conscious decision. She crossed the dusty space between the house and the corral, her footsteps soft. He heard her approach. He heard everything, but he didn't look up, his attention fixed on the final, careful knot he was tying. She stopped a few feet away, leaning against the top rail of the corral fence. The air smelled of horse, worn leather, and the dry, clean scent of hay. The lantern cast a warm, isolated pool of light, making the rest of the world fall away into soft, indistinct shadows. It felt as if they were the only 2 people left in the world. He pulled the knot tight, tested it, and, satisfied, he finally looked at her. His face was half in shadow, the lantern light carving out the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the hard line of his jaw. His gray eyes were dark and unreadable in the flickering light. The question rose in her throat, quiet and unadorned. It was not born of fear, but of a deeper, more urgent need, the need to know. "Are you dangerous?" she asked, her voice a soft counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. Ridge didn't react immediately. He didn't tense or look away. He simply held her gaze, the silence stretching out between them. He picked up a small knife and trimmed the excess thread from the knot, his movements unhurried. He seemed to be considering her question, or perhaps considering the 1,000 different answers it contained. He looked back at her, and a slow, wry, and utterly mirthless smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He squinted his eyes slightly, a familiar habit when he was looking at something far away, or looking at something right in front of him with a startling intensity. "Worse," he said. The word was a stone dropped into a deep well. It was not a boast, it was not a threat, it was a confession. It was a simple, unvarnished statement of fact. It was the truest thing he had ever said to her. A simple yes would have been a confirmation of her suspicions. But worse was something else entirely. It was a testament to a past far darker than she had imagined. Dangerous was a gunslinger in a saloon, a brawler looking for a fight. Worse was the man who survived what came after. Worse was the reason a man chose to live in a secluded valley with only a boy and his ghosts for company. Worse was the knowledge of what a man was truly capable of, not in anger, but in necessity. It was the burden of a man who knew how to make the world a more dangerous place for others in order to survive it himself. It was the scar on his face and the permanent winter in his eyes. She saw it all in that one word. In the steady, unflinching way he met her gaze. He was not ashamed of it. He was not proud of it. He simply was it. He was showing her the locked door, and while he wasn't opening it, he was telling her what lay behind it. A year ago, that word would have sent her scrambling back into the darkness, her heart seizing with terror. A year ago, she had been a girl who dreamed of safety, of a simple and gentle life, but she was not that girl anymore. Mr. Finch and the desert had burned that girl out of her, leaving behind a woman who knew the world for what it was, a woman who understood that safety was an illusion, and that gentleness was a luxury that could get you killed. A safe man would have turned her away at the train. A simple man would have handed her over to Silas. She hadn't survived because she had found a safe man. She had survived because she had found this one, the one who was worse. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not feel like the rescued and he the rescuer. They were equals, two survivors, marked by different fires, standing together in the quiet dark. He had seen the ugliness of her past, and she was now seeing the darkness of his, and she was not afraid. A small, slow nod was her only movement. "Good," she whispered, the word barely disturbing the air. It was her answer. It was her acceptance. It was her own confession. "Good, because I am not looking for a saint. Good, because a man who is worse is a man who can understand. Good, because in this world, sometimes you need something worse than dangerous to keep you alive." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or a deep, weary acknowledgement passed through his eyes. The wry smirk faded, replaced by a look of profound, solemn understanding. The conversation was over. In the space of 10 seconds and 4 words, they had told each other everything that mattered. He hung the mended bridle on a hook, his movements as deliberate as ever. He picked up the lantern, and its light swung, casting their shadows long and dancing behind them. He held the lantern up, a silent invitation for her to walk with him back to the house. As they walked, their footsteps falling into a shared rhythm on the dusty ground, a new silence settled between them. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of cautious companions. It was the deep, comfortable silence of two people who had looked into each other's abyss and had not turned away. They were two different kinds of wounded, two different kinds of broken, but they had both chosen this valley, this quiet life. They had both, in their own way, finally stopped running. The peace of the valley was a living thing, a quiet heartbeat that Clara had learned to match with her own. It was in the low slant of the late afternoon sun that turned the wild grass to honey, in the gentle rhythm of Ridge sharpening an axe by the woodpile, in the sound of Tom's laughter as he tried to catch a lizard near the porch steps. The world outside, with its cruel men and shadowed pasts, felt 1,000,000 miles away. It was an illusion. She knew, but it was an illusion so beautiful and so warm that she had allowed herself to believe in it. That belief was shattered by the scream of a horse. It was a sharp, panicked sound that cut through the tranquil air like a knife. Ridge, who had been rhythmically stroking the whetstone against the axe blade, went utterly still. His head came up, his body coiling with a sudden, lethal tension, his eyes fixed on the high ridge to the east, narrowed to slits of gray flint. Every ounce of the quiet rancher vanished, replaced in an instant by the other man, the one who was worse than dangerous. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, urgent growl that was not meant to be questioned. "Get the boy. Go inside. Bolt the door." Clara's blood ran cold. She didn't hesitate. "Tom inside. Now," she called, her voice tight with a fear she hadn't felt in months. Tom, seeing the look on her face, abandoned his lizard hunt and scrambled up the porch steps. She herded him through the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and fumbled with the thick iron bolt, her hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries to slide it home. She rushed to the small window, peering out. Ridge had dropped the axe. His Colt was in his hand, a seamless, fluid motion that was too fast to follow. He was moving away from the house, toward the cover of the corral, his eyes still locked on the ridge. And then she saw them. 3 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even at this distance, she knew. The tall, thin frame of the man in the lead. The hulking shape of the one beside him. The wiry restlessness of the third. Silas. Jeb. Finn. They had found them. The illusion was gone, and the nightmare was here. The world exploded. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the valley, and a splinter of wood flew from the corral fence near Ridge's head. He didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, raised his Colt, and fired back 2 shots, calm and deliberate. One of the horses screamed and reared, throwing its rider. Clara pulled Tom away from the window, her mind a maelstrom of terror. "Get under the table," she commanded, her voice trembling. "Stay there. Do not move." Outside, the fight was a brutal, chaotic symphony of noise, shouts, the thunder of hooves, the sharp retort of pistols and the heavier boom of a rifle. She could hear Ridge moving, could hear the controlled thunder of his Colt answering the wilder, more sporadic shots of the attackers. Through the window, she saw him take down the hulking man, Jeb, who had been charging the house on foot. Ridge's shot was precise, and the big man crumpled to the ground and lay still. But there were 2 more. They were smart. They were spreading out, trying to flank him, while Finn laid down covering fire from behind a cluster of rocks. Silas, dismounted, was circling around the barn, using it as cover to get closer to the house, closer to her. Ridge saw it. He moved to cut Silas off, firing to keep him pinned down. But in that moment of distraction, Finn saw his opening. He broke cover, charging forward, firing his pistol wildly. The shots went wide, but they forced Ridge to turn. It was the opening Silas had been waiting for. He burst from behind the barn, not firing, but charging. He held his rifle like a club. Ridge turned, bringing his pistol around, but Silas was too close. He swung the rifle in a vicious arc. The heavy wooden stock connected with the side of Ridge's head with a sickening, wet crack. Ridge folded. He didn't cry out. He simply dropped, his limbs going slack, and fell face down in the dust. The Colt slipped from his nerveless fingers. A scream tore itself from Clara's throat, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. She saw him fall, and her world tilted on its axis. He was down. The immovable man, the stone wall she had sheltered behind, was down. Ridge. The name was a sob. She started for the door, a mad, hopeless instinct to run to him, to shield him with her own body. But before she could touch the bolt, the door shuddered, hit by a massive impact from outside. Then again, it was Silas. Throwing his shoulder against it, the old wood groaned, the iron bolt straining in its bracket. She stumbled back, her mind blank with terror. She looked at Tom, who was huddled under the table, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. That look on his face, it was a spear through her heart. It was the look she had worn for years. The door burst inward with a splintering crash, ripped from one of its hinges. Silas stood there, framed in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty, his eyes burning with a cold fire, fixed on her. "Well now, Clara," he drawled, a savage grin spreading across his face. "This has been a long and tiresome chase. Mr. Finch is very eager to have you home." He took a step inside. Behind him, the wiry man, Finn, came running up, his pistol ready. Clara backed away, pulling a heavy kitchen knife from the butcher block, holding it in front of her with a trembling hand. It was a pathetic defense, and they both knew it. "Don't be foolish," Silas sneered. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the small, trembling form under the table. His grin widened. He had found his leverage. Before Clara could react, he lunged forward, not at her, but at the table. He kicked it aside with a crash and snatched Tom, hooking an arm around the boy's small chest and hauling him up. Tom cried out, a thin, terrified wail. "Let him go!" Clara shrieked, her voice cracking. "Drop the knife," Silas commanded, pressing the barrel of his pistol to Tom's temple. "Drop it, or the boy's brains will decorate that pretty wall you've been hiding behind." The knife clattered to the floor from her numb fingers. It was over. All of it. Her flight, her brief taste of peace, her fragile hope. It was all gone. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. And then she saw it. Over the hearth, mounted on 2 wooden pegs, was Ridge's rifle. A Winchester. It was always kept loaded. She remembered him telling her once, in a rare, instructive moment, that an unloaded gun was just a fancy club. Something inside her shifted. The despair did not vanish, but it was suddenly joined by something else, something hot and fierce and primal. It was the memory of a flower pressed in a book. It was the feeling of a cup of cold water on a hot day. It was the sound of Tom's laughter. It was the weight of a single word worse. This was her home. This was her child. This was her man, bleeding in the dust outside. The girl who ran was gone. "Finn," Silas ordered, never taking his eyes off Clara. "Go check on Jeb, then get the horses ready. We're leaving." As Finn turned to leave, a deafening boom erupted from the direction of the barn. It was not a pistol shot. It was the deep-throated roar of a shotgun. Finn cried out and dove for cover as a spray of buckshot chewed up the dirt where he had been standing. From the shadowy maw of the barn, a figure emerged. It was an old man, stooped and weathered, with a mane of wild gray hair. He held a long-barreled shotgun with a practiced ease. It was Raoul, the old ranch hand who kept to a line shack in the upper valley, a man Clara had only seen a handful of times. "You get away from them. You hear me?" Raoul roared, his voice a gravelly bellow. "This is Callahan land." Silas cursed, his attention momentarily diverted. It was the only opening she would get. In 2 long strides, Clara was at the hearth. She ripped the heavy Winchester from its mounts. It was heavier than she had imagined, the wood smooth and cool, the steel smelling of oil and power. She had never fired a gun in her life. She didn't care. She turned, raising the rifle. Her hands shook, the long barrel wavering. Silas, seeing the movement, swung his pistol back towards her, still holding Tom as a shield. "You don't have the nerve, girlie," he snarled. Her world narrowed. The room, the fire, Raoul's shouting, it all faded away. There was only the man, the boy, and the length of steel in her hands. She saw the terror in Tom's eyes, and the cold fire in her soul burned away the last of her fear. She remembered Ridge's stance, the way he held his body, the calm focus in his eyes. She pulled the stock tight against her shoulder. She lined up the sights, a wavering, uncertain alignment. She didn't aim for his head or his chest. She aimed for the one part of him that was exposed below the boy's small body. She aimed for his leg. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder like a mule. A brutal, shocking force that nearly knocked her off her feet. The report was deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, she was blind and deaf, her world nothing but smoke and ringing. Then she heard the scream. It was a high, agonized sound. Silas had crumpled, dropping Tom as he clutched his thigh, where a dark, blossoming stain was spreading across his trousers. "Tom!" Clara cried. The boy, free, scrambled across the floor to her, clinging to her legs, sobbing. The spell was broken. Finn, seeing his boss was down and that they were now facing 2 guns, made his choice. He fired one last, wild shot toward the barn to cover his retreat, then ran to Silas, hauling him to his feet. Raoul fired the second barrel of his shotgun. the blast tearing a chunk out of the doorframe as the two men staggered out into the twilight. They half carried, half dragged each other to their horses and fled, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Silence, heavy and absolute, crashed back into the valley. Clara stood in the center of her violated home, the heavy rifle still in her hands. Smoke curled from the barrel, the acrid smell stinging her nostrils. Tom was a trembling weight against her legs. Through the broken doorway, she could see Ridge, still and silent in the dust. The world was shattered, bloody, and terrifying. But she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't crying. She was holding the gun. She had not only survived, she had protected. For the first time in her life, she had not been the victim. She had been the one who was worse. The echo of the rifle shot faded, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the smell of gunpowder, the coppery scent of blood, and the splintered wood wreckage of their home. For a long, paralyzed moment, Clara stood frozen, the heavy Winchester a dead weight in her arms, the trembling form of Tom clinging to her leg. Then Raoul's voice, rough and steady, cut through the shock. "He's alive. We need to get him inside. Now!" The old man's words were a lifeline, pulling her from the depths of her paralysis. She looked from the still form of Ridge, lying in the dust, to the old man standing in the barn doorway, his shotgun held at a low ready. Action. That's what was needed now. Not fear. The time for fear was over. "Tom, go with Raoul," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. She knelt, pried the boy's clinging arms from her legs, and looked him in the eye. "Go on now. I need you to be a brave boy for me." Tom, his face streaked with tears and dust, nodded and ran to the old man's side. Clara carefully set the rifle down inside the broken doorway and ran out to Ridge. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch. The side of his head was a bloody, matted mess where the rifle stock had connected. A dark, ugly bruise was already swelling around his temple, but he was breathing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. He was alive. "Help me," she called to Raoul, and together they managed the dead weight of the unconscious man. They half dragged, half carried him into the house, through the wreckage of the door, and to his bed at the far end of the room. They laid him down gently, his head lolling to one side, his face a waxy, unnatural pale beneath the tan. The hours that followed were a blur of grim, focused activity, while Raoul, with a grim competence, took Tom to his small shack to keep him safe and returned with a leather pouch of herbs and clean bandages. Clara worked. She cleared the broken wood from the doorway. She righted the overturned table. She scrubbed the floor where a few drops of blood had fallen. She was not erasing what had happened. She was preparing for the new battle that lay ahead, the fight for his life. Raoul returned and examined the wound. "He's got a hard head," the old man grunted, his fingers probing gently around the injury. "But it's a bad blow. The fever will come. We just have to see if he's strong enough to fight it." And so began the long vigil. The world shrank to the small, shadowed corner of the house where Ridge lay. Days and nights blurred into a single, continuous twilight, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun through the small window. Clara did not leave his side. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, something she took in brief, fitful snatches in a chair pulled up beside his bed, her hand never leaving his. She became the keeper of his life. Every 2 hours, she would bathe his face and chest with cool water, fighting the fever that raged through his body, turning his skin to fire. The water would sizzle on his skin, and he would groan, his head thrashing on the pillow, lost in a dark, violent world she could not enter. In these moments, she would hold his hand, her grip firm, and whisper to him, her voice a low, steady murmur. "It's all right. Ridge, I'm here. You're safe. You just have to come back." She brewed the bitter herbs Raoul had given her into a tea, forcing the liquid, drop by drop, between his cracked lips. She made thin, watery broth, feeding him with a patience she never knew she possessed, most of it dribbling back out. But some of it, she prayed, was enough. In the long, silent hours, she watched him. She had spent weeks observing the man of action, the man of quiet competence. Now, she studied the man in utter stillness. She traced the harsh lines of his face, softened now by the vulnerability of his unconsciousness. She saw the silver threads in his dark hair at his temples. She studied his hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard work and, she knew, harder fights. These were the hands that had pulled her from a train, that had bound her ankle, that had so carefully pressed a wildflower into a book. Now, they lay limp and powerless in her own. Raoul would come twice a day, bringing food she barely touched and a fresh bucket of well water. He would check on Ridge, offer a few quiet, practical words, and then leave her to her watch. Tom would sometimes come with him, standing hesitantly in the doorway, his small face a mask of worry. "Is he sleeping?" the boy would whisper. "Yes, honey, he's just sleeping," she would lie, the words a comforting balm for both of them. One afternoon, desperate to fill the oppressive silence, she found the small stack of books on a shelf near the hearth. There were only 3: a worn Bible, a book on animal husbandry, and a tattered copy of Shakespeare's tragedies. She chose the tragedies. She sat beside him, his hand in hers, and she began to read. Her voice was soft, a quiet thread of sound weaving through the stillness of the room. She read of kings and their folly, of lovers and their sorrow, of battles and their bloody aftermath. She didn't know if he could hear her. It didn't matter. The words were for her as much as for him. They were a connection to a world beyond the fever and the pain, a reminder of the grand, terrible, beautiful scope of life and death. The sound of her own voice kept the despair at bay, a small candle against a vast darkness. "To be or not to be?" she read softly, her thumb stroking the back of his hand. "That is the question." In this quiet crucible of care, something profound was happening to her. The last vestiges of the frightened girl from Ohio were burned away. The fierceness she had discovered when she held the rifle was not a fleeting, desperate act. It had settled deep within her, a solid core of resolve. She was no longer a guest in this house, earning her keep. She was its guardian. She was no longer a refugee, grateful for sanctuary. She was a partner, fighting for their shared life. She realized, in the dead of the third night, as she held a cool cloth to his burning forehead, that she loved him. It was not a realization that came with a flutter of the heart or a romantic blush. It arrived as a simple, undeniable truth, as solid and real as the wooden walls around her. It was a love that had been forged in shared danger, tempered in silence, and now, proven in this quiet, desperate battle. It was a fierce, protective, and utterly unconditional thing. It asked for nothing in return but his next breath. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever broke. She woke from a brief, troubled sleep in her chair to find him still, the violent thrashing gone. His skin was cool and damp to the touch. His breathing was deeper, more even. A wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over her. She wept, silent tears of exhaustion and gratitude tracing paths on her grimy cheeks. The battle was not over, but the tide had turned. He remained unconscious for another 2 days, but it was a different state now. It was a deep, healing sleep, not a fevered delirium. She continued her vigil, her hope a small, steady flame. It happened in the late afternoon. The sun was streaming through the window, filling the room with a warm, golden light. She was sitting beside him, dozing lightly, her head resting on the edge of his bed, her hand holding his. A faint pressure, a weak, barely perceptible squeeze of her fingers. Her head snapped up, Her eyes flew to his face. She held her breath. His eyelids fluttered. Once, twice, then, slowly, painfully, they opened. For a moment, his eyes were unfocused, clouded with the haze of his long journey through the darkness. Then, they cleared. They found her face, and they focused on her with a startling, lucid intensity. The world stopped. The buzzing of a fly, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind, it all faded to nothing. There was only the look that passed between them. In his eyes, she saw a million questions. She saw pain. She saw a deep, weary acknowledgement of the abyss he had returned from. And she saw, shining in their gray depths, the same fierce, undeniable truth that she had discovered in her own heart. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She put a finger to his lips, a gesture of infinite tenderness. "Shh," she whispered. "It's all right. You're home." She leaned closer, her face just inches from his. She looked into his eyes, and she gave him the gift of her own truth, the summation of her entire, transformed self. It was the only thing that mattered. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice a soft, steady whisper. The words were a vow. They were a declaration. She was not afraid of the men who had hunted her. She was not afraid of the world that had tried to break her. And she was not afraid of the darkness she saw in him, because she had found her own. She was his equal, his partner, his... A profound, weary peace settled in his eyes. He understood. He had heard every word she hadn't said. He had understood her vigil, her care, her love. His fingers, still weak, tightened their grip on hers. It was not a strong grip, but it was everything. It was his answer. It was his promise. It was his own silent, "I love you." No other words were needed. In the quiet, golden light of the small room, surrounded by the ghosts of the battle they had both survived, their hands, clasped together, said it all. The winter that followed was a time of quiet mending. The valley wrapped itself in a blanket of silence, occasionally dusted with a fine layer of snow that turned the world to monochrome. The cold was a clean, sharp thing that kept the world at bay. Inside the small house, a different kind of healing was taking place. Ridge's recovery was a slow, stubborn battle fought in inches, not miles. The wound on his head left him dizzy and weak for weeks, his movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to his former fluid grace. There was a frustration in him, a caged animal restlessness that he fought to keep hidden behind his usual mask of stoicism. For the first time in his life, he was forced to be still, to accept help, to be the one who was cared for. And Clara was his constant, unwavering shadow. She was no longer just his nurse. She was his partner in this slow climb back to the light. She helped him walk, her small, strong frame a steady support when the world tilted beneath his feet. She read to him in the long evenings, her voice a soothing presence against the howl of the wind outside. She learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them: a cup of water, an extra blanket, the quiet company he craved more than he would ever admit. In this forced intimacy, their silent language deepened, becoming richer and more nuanced. He would watch her as she moved about the room, a look in his eyes that was a mixture of gratitude, awe, and something else, something fiercely protective. She, in turn, learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw when the pain was bad, the slight softening of his eyes when Tom would make him laugh. They rebuilt the house together. Raoul, the old ranch hand, proved to be a master carpenter, and under his gruff instruction, they fashioned a new, stronger door from seasoned pine. The act of mending was a balm to all of them. Every swing of the hammer, every turn of the screw, was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that this home, which had been violated, would not remain broken. They were reclaiming their space, board by board. Clara found a surprising satisfaction in the work, her hands growing calloused, her muscles learning the ache of honest labor. She was no longer just an inhabitant of the ranch. She was one of its builders. When the snows finally melted and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the cold, hard earth, it felt like a collective exhalation. The stream swelled with melted snow, its voice a happy, gurgling song. The air grew soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. And with the return of spring, the ranch came alive. Ridge was stronger now, the last of his dizziness gone, though a new, silvered scar traced a path along his temple, a permanent reminder of the battle they had won. He moved with his old purpose, but there was a new quality to his presence. The hard, solitary shell he had built around himself had been cracked, and he had allowed the warmth of his small, unconventional family to seep in. He began to teach Clara. He showed her how to properly saddle a horse, his large hands guiding hers on the stiff leather straps. He taught her how to read the sky for signs of changing weather, how to track a deer by its prints in the soft earth. He even began to teach her how to shoot, not just the heavy Winchester, but his own Colt. The first time he placed the revolver in her hand, the memory of the fight, of the deafening blast and the recoil, came rushing back. Her hand trembled. "You don't have to be afraid of it," he said, his voice low and steady as he stood behind her, his arms coming around her to help her steady her grip. "It's a tool, like an axe or a hammer. You just have to respect it. You have to be its master." His body was a solid, warm presence behind her. His nearness, the scent of leather and dust that was uniquely him, was both unsettling and deeply comforting, under his patient instruction. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. When she finally hit the tin can they had set on a fence post, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. She had faced the tool of her greatest trauma and had, as he said, become its master. Life settled into a new and beautiful rhythm. It was a life of shared work and quiet companionship. Their days were spent under the vast, open sky, their evenings in the warm, enclosed peace of the house. They would work side by side mending a fence line, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken syncopation. He would anticipate her need for a tool and have it ready. She would have a canteen of cool water waiting for him before he knew he was thirsty. The silence between them was no longer a void to be filled, but a comfortable, shared space. It was a silence that could be companionable. As they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars ignite in the velvet sky, it could be playful, as she would catch his eye and raise a questioning eyebrow when Tom said something particularly outlandish. And it could be deeply intimate, a shared glance across the fire that said more than 1,000 words ever could. Summer arrived in a blaze of glory, turning the valley into a sea of gold as the wild sunflowers bloomed. The days were long and hot, the nights warm and filled with the sound of crickets. Tom, who had been a quiet, worried shadow during Ridge's recovery, was once again a whirlwind of boyish energy, his laughter a constant melody as he chased butterflies through the tall grass. Raoul, his work on the house complete, had taken to spending his evenings on the porch, smoking his pipe and watching the small family with a quiet, satisfied look in his eyes. He had become their grizzled, watchful guardian angel. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Clara stood on the porch, leaning against the rail. The new door behind her was solid and strong. The house was quiet. Ridge was at the corral, brushing down one of the horses, his movements slow and gentle in the fading light. She watched him, her heart filled with a quiet, aching love. This life, this impossible, beautiful life. It was more than she had ever dreamed of, and it was a life she had helped to build, a life she had fought for. The ghosts of her past were still there, but they were faint now, their whispers drowned out by the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods and the steady beat of her own heart. He finished with the horse, gave it a final, affectionate pat, and walked towards the house. He came up the steps and stood beside her at the rail, not speaking, just sharing the view as the first star of evening appeared in the darkening sky. They stood like that for a long time, their shoulders almost touching. Two solitary figures who had found their place in the world, together. She was the one who finally broke the silence. She turned to look at him, at the strong, quiet profile she had come to know better than her own. The words came from a place of deep, settled truth. "The first time I saw you," she began, her voice soft in the stillness, "I was running for my life. All I wanted was a moment of darkness to hide in. I only asked to hide under your coat." She paused, then looked out at the vast, darkening horizon, at the endless expanse of the world that had once seemed so terrifying. "Now," she whispered, turning her gaze back to his, "I want to stay with you forever." The words hung in the warm air between them, a simple, profound, and utterly honest declaration. It was her past, her present, and her future, all offered to him in a single breath. Rich did not speak. Words were not his language. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw it all. He saw the terrified girl on the train, the fierce woman with the rifle, and the loving partner who had nursed him back from the brink. He saw her, all of her, and he did not look away. Slowly, he raised his hand. It was not a grand gesture. It was a simple, quiet movement. He took her hand in his calloused, scarred fingers wrapped around hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand with a tenderness that made her heart ache. His grip was warm and solid and sure. It was not the grip of a captor, but of a partner. It was not a promise of an easy life, free from danger. The world beyond their valley was still wide and filled with wolves. The ghosts of Mr. Finch and Silas were still out there. Somewhere, the danger was real. But his touch was a different kind of promise. It was a promise that she would never have to face that world alone again. It was a promise that this was home. They stood together on the porch of the house they had rebuilt, their hands clasped, watching the stars emerge in the endless sky. They had chosen not to run anymore. They had chosen to stay. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts with you. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it a little extra support by hitting the hype button to help more people hear this tale.